Welcome back to Scale Model Workshop. One of the materials that I found extremely useful for building scale models is epoxy clay. Not only is it excellent for sculpting, like in this example of the mantlet cover for a Tamiya M48, or creating a fillet, here around the dorsal turret of this monogram A26, but it's also excellent for filling gaps and restoring panel lines. Epoxy clay is a two-part epoxy putty that works just like clay. You can modify the consistency, tool it, smooth it, and clean up with water just like clay. Once it's hard, it can be sanded. For these examples, I'll be returning to the continued construction of the Airfix Mark 14 conversion. One of the unsightly issues with this kit is the overly prominent separation around the rocker bulge. Looking at images from Richard Frank's excellent book on Griffin Spitfires, you can see that in some instances the bulge is actually a separate piece, while in others there's no evidence of a separation. In this image by Alexander Miller, it's evident that in the case of two separate pieces, the cowl actually laps over the bulge, so that the separation's only really noticeable when viewed at an angle looking into the joint, and less visible when looking over the joint. The same with this vintage image from the Frank's book. I have no idea about the visual variations, but one thing seems clear. The large space between the parts as presented in the kit is an incorrect way of representing this feature, and in fact I think it's questionable that this minute feature can even be properly rendered in 48 scale. However, with epoxy clay, you have a couple of options. I started by cleaning up the bulge so that the separation would be relatively even, and removing any irregularities from the mating surface so the bulge sits flat. The bulge is then cemented to place. The epoxy clay is mixed to the desired consistency and applied into the joint. The excess is removed with a moistened Q-tip. Here I'm using a dental instrument known as a condenser in an attempt to tool the epoxy clay into a step. This takes the joint from a large space to a recess. The change is subtle and the improvement slight, and this really speaks to the futility of working with a poorly designed and executed assembly, which is why I ultimately opted to fill the line completely with the epoxy. By removing the unsightly, eye-catching, and irregular line around the bulge, I think it makes a great improvement. Also note that I removed the Krispy Kreme style representation of fastener detail, which will be restored later as an engraved circle. Another unsightly joint appears around the carburetor intake. The space around the intake is not at all consistent with the surrounding panel lines. The irregularity appears even worse due to the fact that the underlying recess is basically wide open. The first step involves adjusting the intake piece so that the width of the space around the part was more consistent. The joint was filled with the epoxy clay and the excess removed. You can work the epoxy with any number of items that won't scuff the styrene. Here I'm using the cut end of a Q-tip, and here a wooden stick. You have a good solid 15 to 30 minutes of working time depending on how much water you keep applying. In this case, I tooled the joint with a homemade shaped piece of brass rod. As you can see, it's been modified over time for various tasks. Here's what it looks like after the final tooling. Before it completely hardens, any errant bits of epoxy clay are easily removed from any surrounding recessed detail. And this is the joint after initial priming. The ability to tool the clay into a specific finished shape makes epoxy clay a versatile and valuable material for not only sculpting, but also filling gaps. I hope you found this video helpful, and I'll see you next time.